John, thank you so much for the presentations that you've given about Ultraman, and thank you for the film. I think it's really great. So I'm excited to learn more.
Thanks for coming out.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, so you've talked before about how you set this project up many years ago. I think you said 23 years in the making. It was put to turn around in another studio, but once it came here to Netflix and you knew it was actually happening, how did you know that it would work as an Ultraman film? Not just the original film that you set up?
Well, the reason I knew it would work is because when I had that meeting with the folks at Netflix and they said, how would you feel about making an Ultraman film? And I said, well, fanboy me loves that idea. Writer-director me wants to make the film that I pitched because I had an emotional connection to that story. So they said, well, would you be willing to fly to Japan? I'm like, if Netflix is paying for it, yes, 100%. So we flew to Japan. Tsuburaya really responded to the personal aspects of that story. And once they did that, and I pitched them kind of the big swings I wanted to take with the lore, and they were so supportive of it, then I was like, okay. So then I started to dive into the script, and like, now it was the fun time where we got to talk with the team and like, what things do we want to put in, what things do we want to leave out. So it was like Christmas Eve taking 23 years, and then finally Christmas Day is here, and you get to open up all those presents, and that takes 4 years.
Right. And so, that brainstorming session at Tsuburaya for a whole week, and getting the full franchise, but the legacy download and what it means, and then how we could infuse it. And it really opened up so many opportunities that can help complement this like amazing family theme story that we had.
Well, you talked about the legacy of Ultraman, and I have to admit this is my first Ultraman experience. I've never seen any other Ultraman properties, and I've heard you talk about how you did want it to be accessible for newcomers like me to the franchise, but you still wanted to honor, of course, the long legacy. How do you find the balance between the two, welcoming newcomers and honoring legacy?
I mean, I had talked to Shannon about like what that approach might be, and it kind of came down to us like going like, well, how did we discover Ultraman? And we just like let the visuals like kind of took our attention when we were kids, right? And he has his own experience in the U.S. and for myself, I was in Japan, and it was more about like finding a universal theme and idea that can like introduce what the situation is, draw them in, and then let them discover Ultraman just the way we did as kids.
And how did you develop the visual style? There's so much visual flair in this film, from the visual breaks with it looks like comics. How did you develop what you wanted this film to look like?
So in the same way that we handled the lore, where it was if it supports the story, it's in; if it doesn't, it's out. We wanted it we wanted to create a new style that was inspired by manga and anime, as you mentioned. But we also wanted it to feel grounded. So we wanted the camera work, even though the film was very stylized, we wanted the camera work to feel very natural, using real lenses or simulating real lenses. So working together with ILM and then our art department on the film, and it was just an evolution. It was an evolution of images. So we would get the first few images that push the style really well, and push it pretty far. And I don't like seeing art of books that don't seem to represent the film. A lot of times that style will get beaten out of the film as you're making it. We wanted to preserve that, and we were able to, working with ILM. But again, it had to match the tone of the story we were telling.
Parenting is at the heart of Ultraman Rising, and I'm a dad, and it's just the best. And it's really hard and really tiring, but it's also the greatest. And I feel like Ultraman Rising finds the right balance there. Of course, we can pick up on a lot of that as parents watching this. But what do you want kids to pick up from Ultraman Rising about what it's like to be a parent?
What I hope that kids see is understanding that there are a lot of the things that parents don't share with their kids because we're trying to protect them. And sometimes maybe we're being overprotective of them, of the hardships that we're going through. But sometimes you may assume that they're not listening and that they're not hearing and that they don't understand you at all. But they've been through it before, and they do understand you, and they're trying their best to make your way easier than what they had. So I hope that kids will watch this and want to have a discussion with mom and dad.
I mean, for me, for Ultraman and Ken Sato's like character journey, it's about aspiration, aspiring to become Ultraman, and if it has that sort of like moral compass or some guide for a child to be like, here's a character, here's Ken Sato with a huge flaw, and then he's learned his way through. And I hope that can help inspire kids to do the same.
Awesome. Well, Shannon and John, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the film. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
so much, man. Appreciate you
Scott,
coming
thank
out.
you so much for chatting with me, and especially for your presentation that you gave here at ILM. I really was fascinated to hear more about your score, so I appreciate your time.
Honored. Super fun. Thanks.
So, if I'm not mistaken, I believe this is your first feature score. Your first.
It's my third, but
Oh.
I've done 2 indie documentaries. This is my first really big one. So
Okay,
it's a
got
big,
it.
Yeah, big step for sure.
Yeah, you've been doing a lot of TV and shorts as well. What was it like making that jump into your first feature animation score?
Every project is so different. In terms of scope, it was similar to working on a large series. It was certainly creatively challenging, and it was something where I felt like a huge responsibility to really deliver. But what's funny is I look back to my very first, my first real break, which was doing Presto, which was the theatrical short that came out with Wall-E, one of the Presto ones, one of the Pixar ones. Everything that I've done since kind of had its roots then. The neat thing about working on a short is you really do go through the entire process. It just happens that the TRT is a little shorter. But this was no doubt, this was a really big one for me. Yeah.
I've heard you describe your approach to Ultraman Rising. You said you wanted the music to feel really classic without feeling too nostalgic or like retro. How did you find the balance between the two?
Well, the first challenge there was, the pitch that Shannon gave at the very, very beginning that got the project greenlit at Netflix included this idea of the score being 8-bit meets orchestra. Now, 8-bit is one of my favorite things to do, and I created a Frankenstein synth out of old video game consoles, a Nintendo Entertainment System, a Commodore 64, and playable like a synthesizer. And that was one of the first things I did on this project. But actually making it support any of the scenes that were either really epic or emotional, it just didn't work. It would sound retro in a bad way. But what I found was any time that Ken was failing, any time that something kind of happened that wasn't intended or was him not really stepping into his role as Ultraman, I thought, okay, this is actually an amazing opportunity to do that. And then to ground the entire score into, you miss out on all the low end, and a lot of that is provided by Kaoru Watanabe and these incredible Japanese percussionists that we recorded in Tokyo for this. Gives all of the low end and a lot of the punch. The full orchestra, which gives a lot of the sweeping, epic feeling, a lot of the emotion of what happens in the film, and then ultimately all sort of orbiting around a single solo harp, which is the heart of the entire score. That's kind of how I grounded everything, so that I could have fun with Tim Henson, the greatest living shredder, in my humble opinion, who makes the guitar sound like a superhero. It sounds like a modern superhero in a way that I had never heard before. I could play around with 8-bit, I could play around with Vocaloid, this old Japanese voice synthesizer using the sound of Hatsune Miku, which is apparently, she's like a virtual hologram pop star I didn't really know about before this project. I could have fun with all these different elements as long as it was grounded in Japanese percussion, in the harp, and in the orchestra.
And the other amazing thing that you talked about in your presentation was how you had this sort of family of themes, is how I believe you described it, all centered around one theme and having slight changes based on the character, which is just incredible. Tell me about how you developed the core of that theme and how you had it branch out into the rest of the family.
The hardest scene to really get right was also the most important one. It used to be the opening scene of the movie before a prologue was added. It's the scene where, for the first time and the only time, you see mother, father, and son together watching baseball, making ramen. And I'm getting chills up and down my spine just thinking about it, because it's such a simple theme, but of course when it's ripped away from you, it makes it very profound. But I needed to get the sound of that family, of that core so I just wanted it to feel like a big hug. And I really wasn't getting it right until I brought the harp in. And as I brought in the harp, I was like, well, I'm probably never going to use that again. And then 2 scenes later, need to get that harp back. And soon I realized, okay, this is the main instrument of the whole score.
Wow. I have to hear more about is it called a Vocaloid?
Vocaloid, yes.
What you used for Emmy's theme specifically. It's hard to imagine how that would actually turn into a usable score, and yet you made it happen. How did that come across, and how did you develop actual listenable music for it?
So the now 10-year-long text thread of stupidity that now exists between Shannon, Tindle, and myself, every once in a while features a really amazing idea that turns into something. And he sent me this link to a YouTube video of a demo of a Japanese electronic musical toy called the Pocket Miku. You operate this tiny little toy about the size of a Game Boy with a stylus that triggers these random Japanese phonemes in this really cute gibberish that comes out. And we were just talking about how much we loved it. I think it was Shannon who said, "This sounds like Emmy feels." And it just sort of opened a floodgate. I did a sketch of just an Emmy theme using just the Vocaloid and some 8-bit sounds. I sent it in, and that's actually what you hear. That original sketch with very few changes is what you hear in the scene where Emmy finally comes home for the first time with Ultraman, and you see her kind of doing somersaults and walking around sort of like a puppy or a kitten, and you're hearing that sound, and it shouldn't work, but it works really well.
That's amazing. Last question before I let you go. One of the things I loved the most about your presentation here was you talked about how layered your score is, but also acknowledging that you're not getting, just the average viewer isn't going to necessarily pick up on all those layers. And I think you described it as it's not about people noticing, it's about loving the ride. How do you sort of let go of all the needing people to understand every deep layer that you put into your score and let it blend together with the sound mix and dialogue and everything else happening?
Part of it is I've learned to not talk too much about music while I'm writing it. So what I'm delivering is less ideas, although sometimes I do have to explain some things. It's just showing our directors, Shannon Tindle, John Aoshima, Lisa Poole, Tom Knott, our producers, making sure that they're seeing picture and music together in some meaningful way. Because if I started analyzing everything and I start talking about, musical intervals and things like that, I'm going to lose everybody. And a lot of it is sort of like learning to create the sort of all of the interconnectedness, all of the compositional simplicity or complexity, to kind of keep that as like a secret as I work, knowing that it all might go away. I might get a note where it's just like I have to lose all of it. So a lot of it is keeping it a secret, and also checking myself, like, does it work or not? A clever idea is often the worst idea. Cleverness and music do not always go well together, right? You need to keep it really simple. You need to tell the story. You need to follow a character. I always look at a face of a character, of one character in every scene that I score. I focus on one face, and I follow that face or I follow that voice all the way through the scene. And if the music ever departs from that, I'm going the wrong direction. So keeping things honest, keeping it simple, keeping any cleverness to myself, and letting the music speak for itself.
Well,
Yeah.
I think you did an incredible job on Ultraman Rising. I really loved your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
Hayden,
it.
thank you so much for your presentation here at ILM. I loved hearing more about your work on Ultraman Rising. It's fascinating. Before we dive more into Ultraman Rising, I feel like there's a misconception or misunderstanding of the differences between visual effects and feature animation, or what a visual effects supervisor does in animation. Could you help our listeners understand the difference? What does a visual effects supervisor do on a feature-length animated film?
I mean, it's such a big task. And I think because you're making this entire world, and you're, especially in the case of Ultraman Rising, where you're giving that world a real definite style, you're you're kind of in charge of absolutely everything that's not animation related. So really what I like to do is allow the animation supervisor, so in this case Matt Vig, who did an amazing job on Ultraman Rising, they take care of the performance and deal with, understanding the director's needs for the performance. I deal with pretty much everything else. And when I say that, actually the team deal with it. I'm just there to guide and steer them. And I was so lucky to have the most amazing team here at ILM, and they did just a tremendous job on Ultraman Rising.
Mm. And this was ILM's first fully animated feature since Rango, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So what was the big difference for you in leaping from mostly live action films, visual effects and live action films, back into the world of animation?
It's a really interesting question, and I think there's two aspects. One is scope and scale, because you're building the entire world from scratch and everything's bespoke to Ultraman Rising. Everything has its own style. And then there's a kind of process, simply because you've got so many shots that you're dealing with. They have to move through the different departments so efficiently to make it happen that you need to work in a very orderly fashion. And with that comes a lot of communication with the directors, communication with the Netflix team, and communication back to the huge team at ILM who are actually bringing all these pixels to life on the screen.
Speaking of communication, when you first landed on Ultraman Rising, ILM scored the job. What was the direction that you received from Shannon for what the visual effects in Ultraman Rising needed to look like?
I think unique was probably the first word. Really, I've worked with Shannon before, so we worked on Lost Ollie at Netflix together, and Shannon has a really great eye, and if you ever follow him on social media, he's got a great photography account as well, so he really understands camera, he understands cinematography. And we knew that even though we wanted a stylized look to Ultraman Rising, that we really wanted to kind of like have this grounded, cinematography feel, so that we could kind of use lighting, use camera to kind of like make the show feel absolutely grounded, but also unique and stylized.
And in some of those stylizations you talked about in your presentation, wanting a lot of the effects to feel 2D, even though they were not 2D. So that way you had the ability to move the camera around the effects, still had that freedom. How challenging was that to find the balance between feeling like 2D, but still, of course, being 3D?
It was really challenging, and I think this is also where the unique casting, where you cast people who've got a real eye for the style and the challenge ahead into the team. And so at ILM we have this fantastic global team, and we were able to kind of cherry pick people who had an interest in maybe kind of not doing the same kind of effects that they'd done before, but really pushing the tools to create something new and unique. And it was really interesting. Once we'd found those people, they kind of brought their own level of excitement and enthusiasm to the project, and that's where you just get all these kind of like amazing effects, the splashes, the water, the explosions. They were all kind of able to be handcrafted, art directed, but also they looked just absolutely beautiful, and still allowed us to move the camera wherever we wanted, light them in whatever way we wanted. It was so flexible. We just had a great time with that kind of, with the end battle sequence where it all comes together. It just looked fantastic.
Yeah, you mentioned the water. I feel like we always hear from visual effects supervisors and artists how difficult it is to animate water. I feel like everyone says that's the most challenging thing to animate. And in Ultraman, the water has this almost painterly aesthetic, especially in that final battle as the huge splashes are all around. How challenging was it to not only animate water, which is always challenging, but to give it that painterly feel?
Yeah, it's always a challenge. I think for us it's finding a balance. Everything we were doing, we were balancing what would it feel like in reality. So how do we kind of get the level of reality so that you buy that the ocean has scale and each wave has like a feel of size and weight, because that gives size and weight to all the characters that are in the ocean at that time. And then how do you balance that reality off with the style? And how do we bring painterly elements in? How do we kind of examine how the art department have created their concepts so that we can bring those elements in together and bind them to each other, so that you get this beautiful hybrid of reality, simulation, but then animation, and it all just comes together in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, there's also the incredible textures of the film, that the halftone textures and the cross hatching and ink lines. How challenging was it to implement those, along with, again, making them feel 2D but painted on this 3D environment?
Yeah, I mean, we had a fantastic composite team around the world, and they came up with a myriad of tool sets that some track to the camera, some track to the object, and we art directed that on a shot by shot basis so that we could kind of design ways of affecting the image that didn't draw you out, that felt like they were very organic, very textural, and paid homage to the manga origins that we were trying to bring into the Ultraman Rising look.
Ultraman has such a rich history. So before I let you go, I know you talked about taking a really deep dive into Ultraman. You mentioned how you weren't really familiar with it beforehand.
Yeah.
What were the things that you picked up on in that deep dive that really helped inform your work on the film?
I loved the cinematography. So it's really interesting, even though the show dates back to the 1960s, had a really, really fun use of cinematography. The physical special effects were amazing, and I've done visual effects and worked with special effects technicians, and they always bring such a great value and quality of image to any show. And it was the way that they all bound together into this really, really unique look. Understanding that and then trying to push it into this stylized feature animation was a real challenge, but yeah, one that we knew we were up for the challenge from day one.
Well, the work paid off. The film is incredible. So thank you again for chatting with me. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much.